Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us at a panel discussion update on China today for the Asia Society US Asia Entertainment Summit. I'm very happy to welcome the speakers on this panel, Alan, Jun, Sam, and Andre. Welcome. I will do a very brief introduction and the full profile of each of the speakers will be available on our events website. Alan Eliasoph is a veteran film executive and producer who has spent the last 30 years building bridges among China's film industry, Hollywood, and the global film market. Alan was a former executive at Warner Brothers, who set up Warner's Beijing office in 1994. She then served as CEO of Village Roadshow Pictures Asia and its successor entity, Perfect Village. Alan served as the lead producer of Chinese film director Ning Hao's Huang production company and has most recently launched her own production company, Starry Dome Productions. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you.
Next, Sam Huang. Sam serves as the Chief Executive Officer of Endeavor China, a subsidiary of the global entertainment, sports, and content company Endeavor Group. Before joining Endeavor China, Sam was the co-founder and most recent partner of Xinge Entertainment, a leading premium content provider in Asia. Welcome, Sam. Andre Morgan. Andre built international operations of Golden Harvest Group between 1972 and 1984, responsible for launching careers of Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee, and numerous film franchises, including Cannonball. In 1984, he co-founded the Ruddy Morgan Organization, producing more than 80 films and hundreds of hours of television. Andre went on to advise many media companies formulating a China strategy. Later on, his advisor work moved into large-scale transnational projects in many non-media related projects. Welcome, Andre. Last but not least, Jun. Jun serves as the president of Global Business and Legal Affairs at Skydance Media, who is responsible for running all business and legal affairs on a global basis, related to the development, distribution, and production of all Skydance core content divisions, including feature film, television, interactive, and animation. Prior to Skydance, Jun served as a senior executive at Warner Brothers Pictures and Global Road Entertainment, respectively. Welcome, Jun. Okay, I'm very excited about our discussion today and have some questions I want to talk with each of you. And I know that this is going to be a very informative panel, so let's get started. So first, I want to share some stats that I read from a Variety article just yesterday. According to this article, the global box office recovery in 2021 is accelerating, which could hit roughly $22 billion. And that number alone is 80% ahead of 2020, which is not a surprise given the pandemic starts that year, but it's still 49% behind 2019's record. China on its own is forecast to account for 1/3 of the global theatrical revenues in 2021. And just by comparison, North America represents roughly 22% global market share. So with that in mind, I want to turn my first question to Sam and Alan. So as I understand it, both of you were in China when pandemic first hit, and you have been like operating business from there during the last 20 months. So can you share with us your observation as to how the Chinese entertainment industry is coping with the impact of the pandemic? And what challenges and opportunities that you have observed in 2021 that is different from the challenges and opportunities you have seen during the last year?
Well, I returned to China from being out of China from late January of 2020 to September of 2020. So by the time I got back, production was already in full swing. And the theaters were open, although they were controlling the number of seats that could be sold and were requiring and are still requiring that people wear masks throughout the show. So it was probably the theatrical production marketplace that recovered faster than any other. And essentially, I know during the summer of 2020, there were already some major productions in process. And although I didn't come back until the fall of 2020, there were people telling me what they were doing to make sure that people had negative COVID tests before they got onto the set. They would have closed set environments, but essentially they were full steam ahead. So it's not at all surprising that they're leading the box office recovery as well. There are also other, though, risk factors unrelated to COVID, which we can talk about later, but I think I've said enough for now.
Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, sure. And as Ellen mentioned, I remember when the COVID just exploded, I was literally in Sundance, Utah during the Chinese New Year 2020. And because, I was still a co-founder and, a chief leader for XG back then. And I remember it clearly, at least in Shanghai, we literally only work at home, forced by the government for about 4 weeks. That's it. And after like a month, everyone come back to work in the office because XG, we focus on scripted show and unscripted. And our first production after everything happened, pandemic, the COVID happened, our first production started in May or June last year, 2020. And back then, I remember, if we are talking about Chinese costume shows, those historical shows, you need to wear Tang Dynasty apparels, etc. We typically film it and shoot it in Hengdian, right? And before the COVID period, 2019, Hengdian is always super packed. But last year, at least I will say in the first 3 quarters, it's super easy. It has never been so easy to book a venue and book those palaces to make the production. But everything almost started to get back to normal by the end of last year. In XG, we signed multiple deals with CCTV, iQIYI, or pre-sale deals by the end of last year. And most of the TV production company, I will say, came back in full swing almost by the end of last year. And if we are talking about movie production, Chen Kaige, Wu Jing's Changjing Hu film, till today, their box office is about 5.3 billion RMB.
820 million US dollars to date.
It's a huge number, and that film was produced, partly in last year and part of the post-production this year. So I will say a lot of production came back to work about mid-late Q2 last year. And if we are talking about audience coming back to theaters, it's about the same time. And movie theaters are getting more and more stricter on wearing masks, et cetera. But, people here kind of feel relatively safe because probably this market, government adopt a different approach, right? We still, it's not like a full open, asking everyone for vaccine, totally free, but still once, if we found out any cases happening, like today in Lanzhou, Gansu, they still try to shut down the whole neighborhood, shut down the whole school. So case numbers are really low. And I think that's also part of the reason helping people to feel safer.
Gotcha. And in terms of the inventory available for the audience to see in the theater, is there like a bigger pool of movies available to pick and choose, or you feel that is pretty much shrinking because the production was paused for a long time during last year?
I don't think there's a lack of inventory at all, because production, as I mentioned before, started up again in the film sector, full scale, May, June of last year. And I think there are still a number of many movies, in fact, that are finished and are waiting to get screens, because there's also the issues of how movies are programmed in China. And as you know, this year was the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. So it was a big celebration, but they also put off releasing a number of completed films in order to be able to release some classic patriotic films and also some new films that have been made that are patriotic films. So there's an inventory there for sure.
Gotcha. So talking about the release, I want to see your opinion on the release window. That is definitely like a very heated topic, like everywhere, in particular in the US. So here we're seeing that the release window is basically collapsing. The traditional release window is collapsing and the theatrical window is getting like shortened. In particular now, almost all major studios other than Sony Pictures has their own streaming platform, and many of them adopted the approach to release content. Some of their contents like concurrently on the streaming platform or in the theater. And in terms of Warner, who basically announced like all entire 2021 slate is going to be released concurrently online and in theater. So have you seen similar approach among Chinese companies, or you are seeing something different in there? Because one example I can think of is the beginning of last year when pandemic started hitting the market, that there was a motion picture Lost in Russia was slated to release in the theater, and then it eventually withdrawn from the theater. And then ByteDance acquired the rights and released the picture for free on their own digital platforms. So this move was a big controversial like move at that time. But I was wondering if there are other Chinese players follow suit like since then, and what is your observation on that?
Who's the question for?
Anyone who wants to chime in on that one, who has like.
Well, maybe we should let some of the other people talk.
Sure.
Yeah.
Andre, do you want to take that one?
I can't say for sure because I'm not in China, but talking to my office in Shanghai, I think that the Lost in Russia case was a kind of a specific point in time when people were scrambling all over the world on new content that had been scheduled for release, and theaters were being closed, and it was really the height of everybody everywhere in the world scrambling. It's my understanding now that they're back to a far more orderly progression for content in China, while we in America are still feeling our way through, the negotiations between the theater owners and the studios and the streamers on what is going to be the new, if you will, first in North America, but then I guess secondly, following the US patterns for Europe and I guess eventually for South America. And those patterns are forming. They're certainly not the same as the patterns that we see in China.
That's right. And I would like to add that China is very unique. It has been really since 1949. China is unique in terms of how the culture views the theatrical environment and the importance of having people have a group experience together, either laughing or crying or feeling proud or sad or whatever it is. The function of film in society in a group environment is very, very important in China. And it is also very much appreciated by the audience because they love to have an event. And everything in China now in the theatrical environment is really eventized so that people know that their friends are going to see this movie. People know when they're going to go see it together. Are they going to see it in IMAX? Are they going to see it in 3D IMAX? They have so many choices. They have such a huge real estate in terms of state-of-the-art cinemas in China as well. So I think that the playing around with the numbers and the figures in terms of how much can a conglomerate make from putting something out in cinemas as opposed to putting it out on their online platforms, which is what's happening every day now in North America, that calculus is not as important and in fact is not encouraged. So I don't think that there's going to be a diminution of the theatrical environment in China. I do think, though, that the type of content that will be suitable for theaters is diverging very quickly, as it is in the rest of the world, from the type of content that people will be watching on, TikTok or Douyin or whatever, the short content, which does take up a lot of consumer time and money. Those two areas and platforms are diverging. So people who are producing content have to be very aware of which platform they're producing for.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's very helpful. Okay, so I guess my next question, and Andre, just taking on what you just said, I want to take your advice on the challenges that we have seen about getting imported content into China, in particular Hollywood content. So it's no secret that it has been increasingly difficult to get Hollywood content into Chinese theater. And while China became the biggest theatrical market in the world, which was unexpectedly accelerated by pandemic, the Hollywood studios here are the desire to tap into that enormous market growth is still there. But it seems like the opportunities just become more and more limited. So if you were to advise the Hollywood studios now in terms of their China strategy, let's say like June, if June like knock on your door and seek your advice, what will you tell June about their China strategy? Is that something like they should still pursue, or is that like people should put that on the back burner and just pause?
I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I think that, how shall I put it? Clearly, the Chinese industry and the Chinese society has entered a new phase, both in terms of appreciating domestic content and the kind of content that they're getting guidance to generate for theatrical release in China from the party and from the government. But that said, I think that was also kind of inevitable if you look back over the history of, if you will, the perspective of the last 20 odd years. I hate to sound like an old timer, but there was a point in time where the Chinese industry was on its haunches. They needed content that was going to bring people back to the cinemas and hopefully generate enough income to encourage people to build new cinemas. And I think it was very clear that a strategic decision was made at the highest levels to open the marketplace gradually to a certain number of pictures from the West. That's where we got to the original 12 and then the 20, 34 revenue sharing pictures. But there was never any doubt, if you were listening to what the Chinese were saying, that this was all while they were going through a period of rebuilding their own industry. I think the fundamental mistake that Hollywood made was assuming, as we do oftentimes, arrogance, that they were going to rebuild it in the image of America. And that was never the intent in China. China was clearly out to the best of the practices from America that were applicable to China, the best of the practices from Korea and anywhere else in the world, and give it Chinese characteristics. So while we were busy trying to make product that we thought would appeal to them, honestly, I don't think the American studios were really paying very much attention to what his audience was really looking for, or actually what the Chinese government wanted the audiences to be looking for. And the only thing that's really happened is, just to remind everybody, we went through a period prior to COVID of 2 years of intense re-examination of the direction of the Chinese industry, both in terms of what kind of co-productions they were going to finance and what kind of productions that they were going to be encouraged to make in China. COVID just acted as, if you will, a breaker and then an inflection point, while the rest of the world was sort of following along a couple of months behind what was happening in China on COVID. China was already there with the theaters closed and trying to figure out different ways of reopening the theaters, which brings us to back to the case of Lost in Russia, right? And then what happened is they tried to release a bunch of old classics, and they found nobody was coming to see them. So they shut down that exercise after 2 days, and then rethink it. And so gradually, step by step, as they've reopened, they've also used that to see what works. And clearly Chinese audiences have a big hunger for Chinese generated content, if you will, that has characteristics that relate to the current situation in China. So my advice to June or to anyone is, you got to get back to basics. It's not that China isn't there. It's not that there isn't an audience, but what's going to be both acceptable and commercially viable is about having your finger on the pulse of China and not assuming that one size is going to fit all. And it's not just about dealing with censorship. It's also dealing with a resurgent China. It's not by accident that two of the biggest grossing movies in the history of China are very nationalistic movies. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about, what was it called in English? John On. What is that called in English? Wolf
Warrior.
Wolf Warrior. Yeah.
Or the most recent one. I don't even know what the English name for that is. I guess Gangjing Lake or whatever they're calling it in English.
Lake Changjing. Yeah.
These are movies that are very Chinese, sort of in the tradition that Rambo was very American.
Yeah.
And the importance for America to understand is that's where the Chinese public's taste is at. And back to that point, going to the cinema is still looked on as a communal activity to be shared in a society, not just for commercial competition's sake. We've kind of gone and lost the track. We've lost the thread here in Hollywood right now. The current fad is OTT. That'll pass. It's just like when HBO and Showtime came along, and then, CDs and then DVDs. Because when you run an industry quarter to quarter, you can't afford to make long-term strategic decisions. And that's really the problem.
Thank you.
Jun,
do you have it?
Yeah, and I will add to that, and it kind of follows what Ellen and Sung were saying was there right now it's difficult because there really isn't a deep inventory of local movies, and so supply and demand, they don't need US movies, and so they it's very hard. Like we actually ended up we released Tomorrow War, fortunately, and that we released Tomorrow War theatrically in China, and that was the first kind of big streaming movie that got a theatrical release there. And that was not an easy task to do, because we had, just like every movie, you get through censorship, you have to get the date. You don't really know when you get the date until they assign you the date. They can change the date. So everything is kind of last minute. And in this day and age of, the cancel culture, all the distributors, they're very careful of the type of cuts and edits that they want to make, because they don't want to get caught with their hand in the cookie jar and get canceled because they did a certain cut that's not in public perception acceptable. So there are a lot of factors that that have culminated into making it a very difficult environment to having kind of a big successful US movie in China in the way that we're kind of used to. And for right now, they just don't need us, because they've got enough product there, great product. All of the product in China is, top notch now. You have the top cinematographers, directors, producers, everything there. So it's, we're kind of catching up. And as Andre said, it's like, if you want a hit movie in China, you have to have a movie that's going to play well in China to the local population there. And that's not something that distributors here have an eye on, because it's not a guarantee that you're even going to get the release or you're going to get the date. So, that's not something that you're looking at when you're actually making the movie.
to reinforce what Jun's saying, it's a double-edged sword if you're sitting here in Hollywood trying to figure out how to navigate the waters both of China and the waters of America. Because if you're seen to be successful, I'm sure that somebody in Hollywood will accuse you of pandering to the Chinese.
Exactly. Yep.
There's another aspect to the question of Hollywood content not traveling well to China recently, and that is the nature of the Hollywood content. I'm really sorry to sound flippant, but if you look at, so Wolf Warrior and Lake Changjin are two movies that made over 5 billion renminbi at the Chinese box office, which is, around 800 million US dollars, right? But the other one that came out at the beginning of this year, Hi Mom, that is not a patriotic rah 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 movie. That is a touching, funny, sweet story that any daughter and mother can relate to. And that movie was just a good movie. And people went to see it because, first of all, anyone could relate to it, but particularly anyone who grew up in China could relate to it. So what you see by comparison with these big franchise movies from Hollywood, there's so many successful franchises, the Marvel films, the Bond films, Fast and Furious, these franchises, they have brand recognition. And people will go to see them because they know the brand and they know what to expect, but they don't expect to be moved by them. It's very, very hard. You really have to think a lot in terms of what you're trying to achieve in the China market. Yeah.
Thank you, Alan.
Jane, I want to add one thing. I think we have a lot of questions and doubts about how Hollywood movies will work out in China, right? And I actually have, one of my key observation, which is not only for Hollywood, but for any international movies, for any international service, international products, people just need to get ready to compete in this market. I think competition is a key word for this market. As Jun mentioned, right now, the quality, production quality, the sophistication level of cast, of crews, of directors, writers are way more better than 5 years ago, even than 2 years ago, right? And look at any industry landscape, retail, apparels, even luxury in China, you got to market, you got to promote. So I will say for today's world, I mean, for movie industry, for content industry, it's no longer 10 years ago, it's a Hollywood movie. Means it's a great product, the best product in the world. I mean, local products are catching up. So a key thing is how to compete. That will relate to, in my mind, there is demand here. I mean, given the population number, the demand can be huge. I mean, box office of China can be way more than 10 billion US dollar, to be honest. It's just about how you attract customers to go to the cinema, even to pay on iQIYI for PVOD, right? And the thing is, I don't think, my personal view, I don't think Douyin and Sina Weibo and all those things are competing against long form. But for long form content providers, we should look at those channels as a vital, as a key promotional marketing sales channel to facilitate the box office here. And if you look at Wolf Warrior, it's an ideal case that when it opens up, it was like it was out of the top 5 choice for the audience. And then how people incubate the media buzz, the market noise, and how the cast, how the local director and cast can show up on TikTok, on every media channel, to promote the movie. That is very critical. And I think in the past few years, the only well-done movie I will say was a Sony film called Venom. Venom did tons of creative marketing things. And another example was, Legendary's Godzilla movie. They did crossover with PUBG, one of the most popular mobile game here. And they are willing to give PUBG, which is owned by Tencent, PUBG Mobile, owned by Tencent, 6 to 8 months lead time to do a crossover. And by the way, that video game, that mobile game, has about close to 120 million daily active user.
Wow.
And so tell me about it. Shall Legendary charge PUBG Mobile, or shall Legendary pay PUBG Mobile to do a crossover with that, right? And given that, and of course they have royalty deal, licensing deal, selling skins in the game. And they also made a virtual Godzilla and virtual King Kong in the game. So, given such kind of efforts, you're willing to devote and spend time, resource to the market. And by the way, for example, the top 2 P&A companies, marketing companies, movie marketing companies in China, 90% of their job are for domestic movies. And they are great. they can't find a way to work with Hollywood movies. And Hollywood movies are still doing, I will say, very, very traditional and very minimum level of efforts to promote their movies in China and how to access your target audience. And I will say that that's still about the mindset. We got to compete in China market. We got to compete for the box office.
So let me just stop you there for a quick question. When you say like the traditional marketing strategies of this Hollywood studios, and they have to change their mindset. But one nuance is like when Hollywood studios like license the picture, so unless it's a buyout picture, a revenue share, but if it's a buyout, usually like the marketing was like the China party want to be in control. So maybe the Hollywood studios have a say or consultation right, but eventually the control is in the Chinese partner's hand. And why still, like to your point, the Chinese partner was not utilizing all these tools, the great tools at their hands, like to promote the important movies as the same way they promote the domestic pictures?
I think today, to be honest, I think the demand for Hollywood movies, for international foreign language movie are still there, but we kind of lost the momentum. The momentum is quite important. You need 20 international movies in 2 quarters this year in this market to make people aware, hey, there's an American movie, there's a British movie, there's even an Indian movie, right? You need that momentum for people to bring those topics to be a social media buzz, or we just chat on lunch or coffee time. And about your question, I think to be honest, the total number of Hollywood movies in the market are way much fewer than years ago. And even the major studio movies, I mean, we don't see many movies like Shang-Chi. We are not seeing that, right? And many movies, I will say, because this market is highly, I will say, momentum driven. And so I can tell the former, you will say, buyout movie players, they might change to their business strategy to domestic movie or streaming movies or whatever things, simply because not a single player can create a lot of buzz in the market. You need 10 players, you need 5 players. And by the way, all the major movies, I think today are still controlled and 100% handled by major studios themselves, and not by local like buyout movie players. And I don't fully understand their internal structure, but apparently I think they need to get more localized enough to promote their movies.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a great discussion on this topic. And given that we don't have much time left, I want to shift our angle and then look at the things from a different perspective. So we talk about like how to get Hollywood movie, like more Hollywood movie into China and successfully. How about Chinese content reaching out to the global audience? So with the production like budget goes up like dramatically for the last couple of years, and the quality of production overall just also like increased. Does that translate into a broader audience beyond China? It seems like so far, most Chinese pictures that got released outside of China are more appealing to the Chinese diaspora community. And have you seen any efforts being made try to make Chinese content like speak to the global audience?
I think about 10 years. Oh, go ahead, Jun. You say more.
Yeah. No, I was just going to talk to kind of the phenomenon of the streaming effect, because I think growing up, I'm Korean, and my parents, the only way they were able to see Korean content was if they actually had they had to actually pay for a separate Korean channel. And I think a lot of that you had to pay for a separate Chinese channel or a Japanese channel.
They still do that now.
Yeah, but now with streaming, I mean, it's kind of changed everything. And, like the Squid Games phenomenon, now, everyone has access to foreign content. And I think what you're going to see is that everyone looking for the Squid Games in China, the Squid Games in India, or Squid Games in Japan, it's not going to happen because theatrically, subtitle movies, let's face it, it's not going to be successful in the US. But you may have some momentum on streaming sites. Something hits like, that Squid Games has kind of, reached this epic proportion of, it's hit this social media that everyone's talking about it. And so I think you're going to see more of that from a lot of other territories. I think people are going to have access to see things on Netflix or on Apple Plus or HBO Max. I mean, all of those streamers are now going international. They're opening up international offices in all these territories that are big. And I think they're going to start importing things that everyone is going to have access to. And that's going to kind of blow the doors open in terms of people's access to foreign content that no one's ever had before.
And I think that the guessing game that was being done in the early years of the Hollywood-China relationship, where Chinese producers were trying to guess what kind of movies they could make that would be able to play well internationally. As the China market has gotten so strong and so self-sufficient, they actually don't really care anymore, because the amount of revenue that they can get from an overseas release of any kind just pales in comparison with what they can get in their own market. And it's also never been easy, even with great Chinese movies. It has never been able to secure, they've never been able to secure wide theatrical releases internationally unless they were Jackie Chan or Stephen Chow movies. And that's it. And I mean, I think Jun will remember when we were both at Warner Brothers, we had some Chinese movies, and we had a Warner Brothers as the greatest international distribution network in the world, but we couldn't release them because no one could figure out how to do it and who would go see it. So I think that was just a blip. I think Jun is absolutely right that now everyone can access everything online, and it opens up a lot of opportunities, not so much from a financial perspective, but from a creative engagement perspective with audiences who have a reason to want to watch these movies. So, yeah.
I everything that's being said, but I think, again, to give it a bit of perspective, the in America was Americans are lazy. They don't like to read subtitles in movies. So if you don't like subtitles and you don't like dub movies, where do you go? But actually what we found over the years with Bruce Lee and with Jackie Chan and a few others along the way is if you have stuff that is fresh enough and if you get it out to audiences, the word of mouth will carry it. Now, the truth is what's happened today with the streamers, whether it's Netflix and now Amazon and all of the studios trying to jump on the bandwagon with HBO Plus and Paramount Plus, all of that sort of stuff, is audiences, and especially younger audiences, are getting preconditioned to see content with subtitles, and it's not so painful. And it's not just Parasite, and it's not just. Don't forget, we also had, coming out of France, you had Lupin, and you had a couple of other major series that did major numbers. Where nobody was watching the English version, they were watching the subtitled version. So the good in China is Americans are learning to see content with subtitles. The second part of it, though, is, in truth, there's going to be two other things that are going to drive it. One is whether China ever gets their act together, decide they want to have an international marketing organization instead of the kind of slapdash approach they've had for the last 15 years. And the second thing is going to be the economic circuit, theaters and streamers around the world. People used to say, oh, we were geniuses at Golden Harvest for creating Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, and all of that. The truth was, the simple truth was, we took opportunistic advantage of a time when the American studios were in decline, both in terms of the quality and the content and the quantity of content. And theater owners around the world were coming up short with movies to play. We filled that gap. Now, if the studios continue their accelerated rate of decline as they're having it right now, that same gap is going to appear on a global basis, because theater owners are learning, no, it doesn't work so great to have something that's already played on Netflix playing in your cinemas, or even the day and date. It is taking with you. So logic tells you, especially in Europe, Latin America, where they're not entirely going to be beholden on what the MPA says, they're going to look for other ways to generate ticket sales, because that's their bread. That's a huge opportunity. Now, whether China get it together to go after that opportunity, and based on observation, somewhat skeptical, but let's wait and see how it plays out. Yeah, there's an opportunity.
Thank you so much for sharing your insight and your observation about the US-China relationship in terms of the entertainment space and what happened during the last year or two. And surely it's a very informative session for me, and get to receive a lot of firsthand information from people who are closer to the business. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, on behalf of Asia Society, I want to thank you for spending your time and talking with me today, and wish you a very good day for the rest of the day in Shanghai and also in LA.